Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue in Austin, Texas. You can go to our church website for more information at www.austinuu.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Janis Bookout. Janis is the Executive Director of Earth Day Austin. She has over 10 years of experience in small business development with a focus on marketing, branding, and systems. She has 5 years experience in elementary teaching and 16 years of experience in personal and professional development. She entered environmental work in 2012 when she began consulting for Austin Eco Network, Austin's curator of all things environmental, and then became project coordinator of an EPA-funded citywide project on food waste prevention and recovery. She is also co-founding a global citizens climate initiative called 2020 or Bust. Janis will share with us about the environment, measures being worked on in Texas, and how we can help to preserve the earth. Let's welcome Janis Bookout.
First of all, I just want to say thank you because it's really great to be with you and also with anyone who's listening afterwards. I appreciate the honor of being with you and having what I have to share be important to you. I don't take that lightly. Any one of us could share our personal experiences, and I'm thinking of some folks that are in the room that have been an enormous contribution, Dale and Pat Bula, to this community that, any one of us could share our experiences and it's valuable. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with me as I share mine. And the topic of this conversation is backwards from the future. So I will be sharing some about what we're dealing with here in the area and also in the world when it comes to environmental efforts. But I also wanted to address and talk about an approach to environmentalism and equity that I believe in, and ways in which that's impacted my life and impacted the outcome of my life. I wanted to talk first about why I chose the theme for this slide. This is a PowerPoint presentation. There's very few slides, actually. It's mostly just to remind me what I want to talk about. And the next slide is my family, so I'll talk about them in just a second because that's really critical. But the reason why I chose this slide in particular, what my kids and my son Ryan is here today, I also don't take it lightly that you're here because you and our family it's like we're one. So I'm not the same without you, and the fact that you're here means a lot to me. Everything I do is for you anyway. So anyway, the reason why I chose this slide theme, I found it. I was like, yes. Is because, as Ryan knows, my favorite color is not a static hextone color, right? It's the light, the color of the light as it comes through leaves. It has been since I was a very little girl, and I remember looking, as little as I can remember, I remember looking through, at the light coming through the leaves and feeling so connected to God, whatever I've never really had a clear name or understanding of what or who God is, and I've never really, honestly, really cared, but about defining that for myself. But I've definitely felt connected to this spirit of what makes life possible and what makes life so special to experience. And so when I used to watch leaves and the light coming through leaves, I would feel that connection in my gut. And so that's my favorite color. And so when I found this slide, I was like, well, that has to be the theme for pretty much all slides moving forward. So thank you, Ryan. Okay, this is my family. That's Ryan, obviously, on the right with his hat. Evan is on the left at the top. That's my husband, Jonathan, and myself. And Evan is, they're all musicians, which is really fun for me. So our house is always full of music and instruments. And we're a team. I think our primary intent as a family is to support each other in making sure that what we're about in the world gets fulfilled, whatever that is, and kind of always in the process of discovering that and supporting and empowering each other and having that happen. So our house is sometimes really messy, but our dreams are not. Well, actually, they are too sometimes, but we support each other in that. So that's, I just couldn't talk about anything that's important to me without talking about that. So the first thing I want to share is how I got into the environmental work to begin with. So I had done all those things that were mentioned earlier. I was a teacher for 5 years, and I was a textbook editor, and I had done business development. I'd done a lot of things, and I was a mural artist for a while. But what I had also been developing myself as a leader in some personal and transformational work that I had done, and in the process of doing that, I realized that I really wanted to bring my leadership to issues related to the environment, and particularly climate, but the environment in general. But the problem was I didn't really know anything about it. I hadn't studied sustainability in college. I didn't know anybody in the community. This was in 2012, 2013. I really had no clue about any of it. So when I thought about bringing my leadership to the world of environmental work, I thought, well, I'm going to look like an idiot, and I'm going to make mistakes and feel terrible about them. I'll have heartbreak, confronting what's not working about our environment, and there's a lot, as you know, that doesn't work about the way that we treat our planet and the impacts of that and where we are as a society, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I just felt like, failure was imminent if I chose to take on this profession. And was I up for that? And I at some point discovered that was an inauthentic fear. And I created the possibility of being an extraordinary failure. When I looked in life at all the people that I really admired, like the work that Gandhi had done, and Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King Jr., and many other greats, like my grandmother, who raised 9 children, that you would never hear about publicly, but are still in that category of people who I really admired. They were extraordinary failures. And what I mean by that is that they embraced failure, they failed regularly, they failed on their way to fulfilling what was important to them. They were unafraid, maybe they probably were afraid actually, but they were willing to set their fear aside and give their word to something that existed in the future, that did not exist now. And then give their entire being, their entire speaking, their entire reputation, their entire everything to fulfilling on that goal. And it's really hard to even talk about it as a goal, because it's more like a possibility for a future that does not yet exist but could. It only exists in our speaking and the honoring of that future. So when I discovered that I could be an extraordinary failure, I was like, oh, I can do that. Like, I can actually be a failure. As long as I'm willing to fail, I can walk into any space, I can walk into any situation. All I have to do is show up and be who I am and create what I'm creating and deal with what's between me and that future that I'm standing for. And it really kind of it was like, oh. And so I started walking into, I didn't even know what I wanted to stand for yet, and I will get into that too. Anyway, I started walking into spaces and just saying things like, well, I really don't know what I'm talking about here because I haven't been around, but I have a question, but I have an idea, and maybe this isn't a good idea, but I'm gonna say it anyway. And people, responded to that, and we had, and I realized that none of us know what we're doing when it comes to environmental work. Honestly, I don't care how much experience you have, and I have a lot of experience now. I can't say that I'm a novice in that area anymore. I probably have, I have done some study in sustainability for sure, right? So anyway, it just changed my life. What I then also discovered, so at that time what I did was I went to Brandy Clark Burton, who many of you may know of or know, and I said, Brandy, can you just tutor me? Can you just take me under your wing and introduce me to the community? At the time she had just gotten the 4th running best environmentalist in the city. And so, and I was, and I knew her, and I just said, at first she said no, because she didn't have time, but then eventually she said yes, and I just helped her out with stuff, and I interned with her, and she introduced me to everyone, and I ended up taking over a project on food waste prevention and recovery Learned a lot about what that was and about what it is to bring communities together to make a difference. And so along the way, the purpose that I have discovered for my life and what my life is really for is beauty. It's really for that every person gets to experience the exquisite beauty of life. So that's why environment, and that's why all of the more recent work that I've done in the world of equity, inclusion, and diversity, and I'll again get to some of those things, but it's really for beauty, and it's beauty for everyone. So that's what my life is for. Now, when I talk about embracing a backwards from the future kind of life, I often talk about the gateway drug. And I don't, my gateway drug was a peanut butter jar. So when I was in the middle of the project where I was doing food waste prevention and recovery, and like seriously within a very short time frame, we had all of the, it was the Restaurant and Hotel Association. Both of those associations were participating in this citywide project. Mayor Lee Leffingwell was involved. We had a conversation with that group about what are the barriers to entry in food donation as a way to divert waste. And what you may know is that the methane produced by waste is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. Now they're a little bit different than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, methane doesn't. But methane is incredibly more potent, and it can accelerate things, and it can trigger, if there's too much methane in the atmosphere, it can accelerate the triggering of other system changes that then cause more problems, okay? So methane's a very big issue. And food waste prevention is a way to reduce methane emissions. And so that's the context in which we were doing this project. And anyway, it became something that we were all working on. The mayor declared that year the year of food waste prevention and recovery, 2013. And we had a bunch of stakeholders involved. And as part of that, we went to go to the Four Seasons and meet with the general manager of the Four Seasons about his program, because they were doing 90% diversion. And he said in that conversation, "What more can I do?" He thought that our meeting was about him doing more. We thought the meeting was about how can we learn from you. And when he said that, I was like, wow, if the head of a significant organization in town is asking the question, what more can I do, when they're already doing what is publicly considered 100% diversion. I mean, it's as close as probably most organizations ever get, right? And he's asking that question. Well, I went home that day, and I was making myself, I was scraping a peanut butter jar to make it clean enough to recycle. And because, you have to do that to make the plastic recyclable. So I was doing that. And as I was scraping the peanut butter jar, I had this thought. I was like, how much waste is in this peanut butter jar? What if I just kept scraping? What if I got every little bit of peanut butter out of that jar and made that be my whole world in this moment? And I did. And I got a whole sandwich worth of peanut butter. And I have a jar that looked something like that, okay? A sandwich. I ate a sandwich. I wasn't gluten-free at the time. I am now. But I ate a whole sandwich worth of peanut butter. And it shocked me. And that was my gateway drug. I just fell in love with conservation. I fell in love with disrupting my automatic behavior to make a difference. So it's a key theme in my life now, disrupting the automatic. The things that don't work about our environment are a sum total of automatic behaviors that we've found to justify and institutionalize and make part of our process, rely on. And how we are as human beings is not awake to that. We are not awake to our own automatic default behavior. If one makes one's life about disrupting and noticing first and then disrupting one's own automatic default behavior, then maybe we have a shot. But until that happens, forget about it, because there are just too many people on this planet operating in default mode, doing what, and I don't mean just in the environmental space, I also mean in the world of having this planet work for everyone with no one left out. And there's many of us who assume that because we have certain values or certain attitudes or certain political views that we are the exception to that. No. As I've discovered, no, absolutely not. In fact, many times it has us blind to the ways in which we are automatically degrading the environment or taking advantage over someone else without even realizing. So, this is my gateway drug. The next gateway drug after that, and I highly recommend falling in love with this process, was when the first day, and I think Ryan probably remembers it, the first day that we had like one bag of trash for a week. It was like and we didn't even put it out. We were like, it's gonna stink for a week, but let's not put the trash out just for the experience of not putting the trash out this week. And there's been plenty of days since that time. But that first day as a family where we only had one bag of trash for our household, it was actually half a bag, and we decided not to put it out on purpose, that was a really powerful day for us. So after about a year of working with food waste prevention and recovery, I then had another discovery. I discovered again that there was still a fear in the background of the work that I was doing, which was I didn't want to confront the reality of climate change. I knew a lot of people who were working on climate change, and in my conversations with them, I found out that some of them know a lot about it, and some of them actually don't, that are working on it. Don't know what I mean by when I say that. They didn't necessarily know the answer to the question, well, where are we now as a society? Do we have a shot? What's the sum total of what would make the difference to close the gap in actually ending the climate crisis? There's a lot of people working on climate. But if you listen and you really get in conversations, there's not that many people working on ending it. And when I say that, I'm borrowing some terms from a gentleman named Lachlan Arts, which is involved with a group called he's the director of a group called 2020 or Bust. I'm involved with that group, and I have since 2015. And how that happened was I started, I was in another seminar and I was thinking about this, and all of a sudden I honestly just started to cry, and I was like, I don't want to face the grief. And I don't want to face the grief of what I would have to confront. And when I saw that, I also saw that beauty, which is what my whole life is for, and grief arise together. So you can't have one without the other. And I think really anybody who has practiced a faith or has practiced a worship or has practiced a connection to the physical world, even if there's not a belief in a specific God or gods, whatever the belief is, anyone who practices a spiritual practice or a connected practice, at some point there's that experience that beauty and grief arise together, that this life, the way that we get to enjoy it, is hand in hand with grieving. And so I said, well, I'm going to take it on. And one of the first things I did was I sat down with my kids and I looked them in the eye and I promised them to cause an end to the climate crisis before it's too late. And then I had to explain what that meant because they didn't really know that much about the climate crisis. And I believe in telling my children the truth. So we sat down and had a conversation, and I just said, this is my promise to you. The whole rest of my life is about that. So why would I make that promise? I have no business making that promise. Promising to cause an end to the climate. I noticed I didn't say ending it. I have no delusion that I can personally end the climate crisis. But causing it is a different thing. So one of the things that I started to question was, well, who would end the climate crisis? Where would someone be thinking from that they would end the climate crisis? That someone or some group would end the crisis, where would they be thinking from? Who's already thinking from there? And is everyone already thinking from there? Is there a global initiative to end the crisis? And if so, where does it exist? And so when I realized that, I just discovered, someone who would cause an end to the climate crisis is someone who had a promise in the matter. And then they would ask the right questions, not the other way around. So thinking about backwards from the future, sometimes there are things in life where you can't discover even the path until you've made the promise. You really have, there are things that are accomplishable in life where you cannot accomplish them without asking the right questions, and you can't even think of the right questions until you've already made the promise, which is an extraordinary failure, isn't it? So, there's a day in the future, I say, where we have done the last cleanup, and we have dealt with every inauthenticity in our society, inequity in our, inauthenticity will continue as long as human beings exist. Inequity in our society, resolved it, and all we have to do is just be together. Maybe it's 300 years from now, maybe it's 500, I don't know. But there's a moment in that future, and my life is for that moment. In that moment, everyone can just enjoy the beauty of life. That's the moment I live for. So that's why I gave that promise. And I also knew that if I didn't look my kids in the eye and make that promise directly, that I would probably back out at some point. But if I told them that promise, I'm on the hook for life. So I made it. And then I found a gentleman named Lachlan Arts, whose picture is not in this, but this is Lachlan Arts right here, which I'll explain in a second. Lachlan was running a group that eventually we called 2020 or Bust. But the questions he was asking were the same questions I was asking. And he was asking those questions of scientists that worked on the the UNFCCC report. He asked that question of folks that worked for the sustainability goals. He asked that question of people who work on the UNEP emissions gap report, which is what this graph is from in 2014. Now, graphs are boring, so the only reason why I'm including this graph is because it represents the gap. So what this graph talks about is how all of those agreements that how many people know about the Paris Agreement? Okay, is there anybody who doesn't know about the Paris Agreement? Because I'll give a little summary. A couple people? We all are clear? Okay, so the Paris Agreement, for those who might be watching and don't know, is there were 197 countries who came together to make an agreement about actions that we will take to reduce emissions by a sufficient amount in order to end the climate crisis as an aspirational goal. It's not a plan to end the climate crisis, to be clear. It's a plan for working together, and it's an aspirational goal. And it's a declaration of intent, of political intent. And so there's a group called the UNEP Emissions Gap Report Team that takes all of that information, calculates it, and says, does that get us there? If we add up all of the promises of all of those 197 nations, and let's say they meet them 100%, they meet them 50%, they meet them kind of whatever, like the different levels of meeting those goals, what does that add up to? And where it actually takes us, so this is baseline, that's where we're headed. That trajectory by the end of the century gets us at about 5 to 6 degrees warming. That's where we would go if we took no action. The yellow trajectory, so that I can still be heard, the yellow trajectory is current policy trajectory. So in other words, and then unconditional INDC case is underneath that. You can't actually see it, but it's fine. It's the orange line. And conditional is the green line. Those two represent sort of the low and the high of all of those promises made together, okay, and where that gets us as a society. Well, by the end of the century, where that gets us is 3.5 to 4 degrees warming. And if you know about the Paris Agreement, what you may also know is that the goal is 1.5 degrees warming. Now, when we say warming, just for clarification, what we're talking about is warming in Celsius since the pre-industrial era. So since we started doing, mass manufacturing, which was, the beginning of the creation of mass emissions on our part, what that warming since that time has been. Okay, so the gap, according to this graph, by 2030 is 12 gigatons. That's 12 billion tons. Okay, now at the 2020 mark, it's 8 gigatons. Now this graph has since changed. They pushed it because they pushed their goal to the future. So when you look at the UNEP emissions gap report, it's now based on a different goal because they're no longer seeing it as possible to stay on that trajectory, okay? But 3.5, 4 degrees warming is not sustainable for humanity. That's the reality of the situation. What does that look like? There's lots of different interpretations of what that looks like and how long that, when that impacts us, how it impacts us. There's lots of conjecture about how that impacts us. But over time, if that's where we're headed, it doesn't work. So what we want to do is get to the 2-degree trajectory. So 2020 or bust asked the question, what would close the gap? 8 gigatons by 2020 would close the gap. Well, what does that look like per person? If each person took on, I am the cause of ending the climate crisis, what would that look like? It's 16 tons per person, which is under the typical family emissions rate, by the way. So things like, and Dale is an expert beyond me in this area, but if you purchase your next car as electric, it has an enormous impact. If you plug it into solar, it has an enormous impact. If you eat less red meat, it has an enormous impact. If, like me, you dress in everything from Goodwill, you reuse instead of buying new, or you buy local, all of that has an impact and adds up. And so 2020 or Bust created an app where collectively as a global community, we add our actions into this app, and it has a global game. And the game is 8 gigatons and committed by 2020, and 500 million people committed. Now we're nowhere near that yet, okay? And we have the end, we said the end of 2020. So December 31st still counts, by the way, if we get to 500 million, just saying. So when we get to 500 million. But as you can hear, that's really what that does is it's taking an impossible game and turning it into an almost impossible game. That's what 2020 or Bust is about. So, working the gap. So when you have a future that you're committed to causing, that is the expression of who you are in the world, who I am in the world, is beauty for everyone, with no one left out. And there's a project, there's a goal, there's a commitment I have for the future, which is the end of the climate crisis. That's one commitment I have. And what that looks like is closing the gap. And all I have to be is an extraordinary failure to be at work on that. I'm willing. So, and this for me is challenging to talk about, and why is because I'm not at the losing end. I come from a pretty privileged situation. Growing up, I pretty much had what I needed. I also had the privilege of being white in our society, which comes with advantages. And I was pretty blind to that privilege, so I kind of walked around unaware of my privilege and the impact that being unaware of my privilege had on other people. So I've been really in that inquiry lately. And while I'm not going to get in fully into how I came to embracing that, I have done some really pivotal work called Undoing Racism, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that program. If you haven't done it and you're serious about doing the work and you're willing to go deep, that program is extraordinary. It was life-changing for me. And since that time, I've been much better equipped to ask the question, where am I by default ignoring opportunities to disrupt the complicitness with which I operate? Because we're all part of, this is a great story to tell. And mostly what I'm going to talk about is, I'm just going to share stories. So I watched a show recently called, what's it called? What's that show called that I've been watching? The Good Place. Have you seen The Good Place? Oh my gosh, it's so good. So in that show, basically, there's a demon who creates heaven for people. There's 4 characters that he's out to torture, and they don't know that they're not in heaven. They think they're in heaven. 2 of them know they don't belong in heaven. And so the first season is all about them discovering that they're actually in hell and trying to get out of hell, okay? The second season, this demon comes to Earth to follow the people who actually did escape and went back to Earth. And he discovers a compassion for humanity, because these are ordinary people that went to hell described as heaven. And one of them, for example, is a philosopher who can't make a decision. Another one is a very selfish woman who's basically, she hasn't done that much harm in her life except she's just really selfish and doesn't care that she's selfish. But she has to figure out how to care because otherwise she'll lose her place in heaven, which is her form of torture. So anyway, enough about that. But anyway, he chases them to in the second season, he goes to follow after them. In the third season, he discovers that there's this problem. And the problem is that no one's gone to heaven for the last 400 years. It's based on a point system, and no one's gone to heaven for the last 400 years because, and at first he thinks that all the demons have rigged the system, but they haven't. What's actually happened is that in the last 400 years, as people have tried to do good, it's harder and harder to do good because everything that you do is connected to something that does harm. And I don't know about you, but don't you experience that on a daily basis? That everything we participate in is part of the problem? And yet, how we live, we're here. So being responsible, being willing to be responsible for one's own complicitness, and being awake to how we are complicit with the problem is radical. And also, if you're willing to be awake to how you're complicit, then you can start to distinguish ways in which you can offset that. So I'll give you an example. We were working on, as Earth Day, I worked for the previous nonprofit that ran Earth Day. Now there's a new one that I started this year, and we're going to do Earth Day next week on April 13th at Houston Tillotson University. And as part of, would you mind clicking that? As part of a gift to the community, Earth Day 2 years ago paid me while I contributed to the Harvey relief process. And one of the things that I did was I worked with a group that had that was doing crowdsourced rescue and picking up boats. And what we did, my team deduped the data. So there was like 25,000 entries, and we got in and took the extra entries out so they could see the ones that actually needed help. And at the end of the process, and this was on September 4th, they went to go help with Maria. And when they did that, there was a graph, and this data was being used by multiple organizations at the time. And I had access to this screenshot. I took the screenshot of a heat map of where the emergencies had not been addressed. Now, remember, this is crowdsourced, so people just naturally went to go help people and registered it, and then the complaints were resolved, okay? Or the calls for help were resolved. Well, this area here has the highest population of people of color, and that's Harris County in Houston. And then this area here is Port Arthur, which is predominantly elderly families of color. So I saw that shot and I captured it because I asked this question. I'm like, what is happening here? So I started working with several organizations. We started working on, I was working at the time with a group called the Miracle Team, and one of our goals was to provide effective communication during disasters, because a lot of times the communication can be very reactionary and miss things like, where are the vulnerable communities and where are the predictable breakdowns? Because the needs of our vulnerable communities are different. And I personally, that in a world of privilege, I'm not necessarily going to distinguish what's going to make a difference for someone whose world I don't share. So what will? So we started looking ahead at disasters and identifying what are those areas that this kind of thing could serve that we could then communicate in advance. And by the time that the North Carolina, by the time that Florence hit, we were sourcing North Carolina with data that redirected them to a vulnerable community that needed assistance. Several, actually. So, equity. If you care about the environment, if you care about the future of the planet, you must also care about equity. And what I mean by equity is access to resources for everyone. And to think that a good attitude about that is going to carry the day, it just won't. Because where we think from is naturally complicit and blind to us. Where we think from is, now when I say we, I'm speaking about a group in particular, which is, myself as a privileged white woman, liberal, Doesn't matter that I'm liberal, but that's just the case, right? So my personal take is I'm privileged, and I'm going to ignore the ways in which, unless I pay attention, I'm going to ignore the ways in which I'm complicit with an ineffective system that does impact people. So the only thing I can do is counteract that moving forward. And it takes thinking, and it takes asking questions, and it takes being incredibly respectful and not barging in and taking over of a situation where a community is answering their own needs. It takes a lot. And it takes training, too, which is why I would highly recommend Undoing Racism. It's just really only the beginning to me. For me, I'm in the beginning of that process. I'm a student of that process, not an expert. Creating a future. So the other future that I've been working backwards from is Earth Day. So Earth Day Austin got created as it is now, got created in the summer. We had, the Earth Day Festival has existed in Austin since 1970, and it's been a beautiful history of a rich festival that's grown over time and handed on from generation to generation of people. Lots of different people have run it, the most recent being Reed Sternberg, who was my boss for 3 years. He's a really great guy. And the 7 years he ran the festival, the last 3 years, that was within a nonprofit called Earth Day Texas Austin, and they had funding from, we got funding from the festival itself through our sponsorships, but we also got funding through an individual, and last year that changed, and so we started a new nonprofit, of which Reed is on the board, and we're really excited because what we're now doing is building a festival that is the reflection of that builds on everything that's come up to up till now, and remains a free to the public festival for families and children as they come to explore the different ways that they can participate in their commitment to impact the environment in a positive way. So this is our board and this is our team, and we are in the process of working backwards from a future where the festival is successful, except we're running on a festival budget. That's different than operational year-round funding. So we actually literally said to ourselves, like, how are we gonna do this? Because there's a certain amount of revenue it takes to put on a festival, and it takes a certain amount of staff to put on a festival, but is there gonna be enough sponsorship? Is there gonna be enough money coming in to actually make that happen? And what's the downside if we don't do that? Well, the downside is next year's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We have this enormous possibility of amplifying environmental messages like crazy. So we shouldn't let I say shouldn't, but I was to myself, I'm like, I'm not gonna let the momentum of this festival dissipate right before the 50th anniversary. Are you kidding? That's like crazy. I'm not gonna do that. So I stepped up, and a team surrounded me to step up with me, and we are in the middle of making the festival happen. And the truth is we've got, I don't know what the amount is, but we've got a very small gap that we're just about to close. So we will, by the festival, be in the black, have an incredible festival. Veg Fest is now actually joining us, which fortunately this won't be published until later because I'm not supposed to make the announcement till tomorrow. But it'll be at Houston Tillotson University on April 13th, and it's going to be amazing. And the thing I love about the festival is that, no matter who you are, you come to the festival, it's free to the public. So I don't care whether you're getting face painting or you're climbing the rock wall. No matter who you are, if you want to do that activity, you can do that and you don't have to pay for it. That's important. And it's one of the only festivals in our city, Veg Fest is another one, where we actually can offer that kind of immersive, rich experience. I mean, we have electric cars, and we have a butterfly walkthrough, and we have a rainforest listening experience, and we have, it's just like all hundreds of activities that are immersive and interactive, and it's all free. Now, it's miraculous that we're doing that. It really is. When you know the numbers, and I don't have to get into the numbers, but when you see that, I'm seeing the numbers, and I'm like, how are we going to get that done? But how we did it and how we're doing it is we're working backwards from a future of success. And everybody on the team is clear that that's what we're doing. Everybody on the team is clear that what we have to account for is is where we are now, but also what's missing between where we are now and the fulfillment of what's really possible. And that game is never over. So I promise you, at the end of the festival, we will have at least 10, 15 things that we come up with that are like, wow, we missed the opportunity here. Or like, wow, that really was like, man, we really did not do that one the way that we wanted to. But what we're out to accomplish is this extraordinary experience for our community where at the home of an HBCU, our beautiful, oldest higher education institution in our city, and honor what it is that they provide to the community as an HBCU that's also committed to environmental justice. They have an environmental justice degree program over there. They have solar on their roof. They are doing sustainability really well. And to be able to bring the environmental and environmental justice community together in that space is such a unique privilege. And to provide that free to the public is extraordinary. Something that I would never want to step away from or not fulfill on. And so we're doing that backwards from the future. Is there anything else? Oh, my favorite story. The Unforeseen. So the last thing I want to say before we get into Q&A, and I want to just check and see, how's my time? Are we at about 25 minutes?
We have about 17 minutes left.
Of the 30? Or of the total? Of the hour?
We have 17 minutes left.
Okay, I'll take 2 more minutes for this story and then we'll open it up. Does that work for you? Okay, cool. So when I was 26, I was really clueless about the environment or equity at that point. I had just moved to Austin within a year, and I was in love with my husband, who was my fiance at the time, and I was in another seminar, and it was the excellence seminar, and they had asked the question, where's an area of your life that's not excellent? And in my mind, it was that when I was riding in the car with my husband, I couldn't sing. When I drove myself in the car, Ryan, this is the story, by the way, the one he wants to hear. So when I used to ride in the car with my husband, when I used to ride by myself, I would sing like crazy. It was a big form of self-expression for me. And I would just sing and sing and sing and sing at the top of my lungs. But once I was riding in the car with my husband, who's a musician, who has a beautiful voice, I felt self-conscious, and I didn't want to sing. And that's where my life was not excellent. So I decided so the project that we had to create was bring excellence to an area where there is none. So I said, I'll be a lounge singer for a night. And in my group at the time was somebody who managed the Victory Grill, and she generously offered her space. Now, what you may or may not know about the Victory Grill is that it has an enormous history in our community of blues and jazz, and it has been a pillar in our communities of color. It has historically been a black-owned business, and it is actually a historical facility here in Austin, and it has held some of the amazing greats in blues. So I didn't know any of that at the time. I just knew I had a venue to do my act. I'm glad I didn't, because I think I would have been way too afraid, honestly. But anyway, I put this performance together, and it was my husband's band. I had 16 songs. I had 2 outfits. One of them was a sparkle top and pants, and the other one was this like long gown with rhinestones at the back and tall sparkly shoes. And I told everyone, we had a keg of beer so that people were like loosened up for the experience. And people had to write down during the time, what is a dream that you've never fulfilled on, that you're willing to take on now? And the rule was, the worse I got, the more they had to clap. So that was how we set it up. That was smart, because I'm not a professional singer, so some of the songs went okay, but others were not so good. And but I did it, 16 tunes, right? So, and the first one I had to get back up. I went up and I bombed, and then I was like, I'm gonna come back up again. You guys are gonna clap it even louder. We're gonna start this whole thing over, and I'm gonna make it through this first song. And they were like, yeah, right? That was the whole thing. Well, and we actually ended up paying, we didn't fill the room as much as we wanted to, so we actually ended up offsetting that cost by paying for the difference, which I'm really glad we did. Anyway, that was all amazing. It was an amazing experience, but here's what you don't know. John's mother, at the time, had not talked to his father in 21 years. And she wanted to come see them play together because his father was playing in the band with us. He was playing piano. We brought our stand-up piano. It had a gold back to it, so the gold shined, and my sister made a whole backdrop. My sister that night danced with her wife for the first time, not wife then, but girlfriend, for the first time ever in public. And so my husband's mother decided to come. It was her birthday that I scheduled it on. I did not know that. And it was a full moon. So she's like, I'm coming, and I'm wearing glasses, and don't tell anybody that I'm coming. And I was like, Judy, please, don't put me in that position. Well, they ended up knowing. And there was a moment when she walked up to my husband's father, and they saw each other for the first time in 21 years. It was profound. And the next day, we went to go get ice cream together. And my husband and I were sitting in the back of the car with his mother and father driving to get ice cream. And he looks at me and he's like, how did this happen? And I was like, I don't know. It was unforeseen. It was miraculous and unforeseen. Well, we had our wedding a year later, and everybody got along great, because they'd all kind of broken that ice. My father and mother were there that night. Everybody got to know each other in this bizarre experience, and we had a great time. And within a year after that, both of my husband's parents were dead. Separate situations, very unusual situations, but that happened, and they were gone. And we had that moment, and that was complete. Never would have happened. So the unforeseen, sometimes when you are courageous enough to work backwards from a future, what's also possible is way beyond what you even think of, could even imagine. And it hits you over the head, and it's like, what? So that's what I got.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, Janis. We were lobbying this last week at the legislature for 5 climate-related bills pushed by Texas Impact, and all of them got favorable responses from the people that we visited. So we have hope. I think hope is really important.
It is important.
Also, for those of you that are here might be interested, right after we finish here in room 13, I'm going to be joining Bryce Naylor to talk about the 2018 UN report on climate change and shifting extreme weather patterns. So if you'd like to join us for that, that's also possible. When you talk about funding for these nonprofit events, do you do crowdsourcing funding, or do you have to go look for wealthy donors?
All of it. Really all of it. It's kind of like, I'll borrow a term that the director of the other organization, 2020 or Bust, used, which is throwing spaghetti at the wall. Sometimes it just takes throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. But can I acknowledge you for something, Dale? Because something you said about you need hope. Hope, like hopeful, I don't advise, because it's kind of doesn't see, but that's not the kind of hope that Dale, I think, is talking about or what he embodies. Hope from commitment, like connected to a bigger purpose, unwilling to waver from that purpose, and constantly presencing that future for yourself and doing the work. That's who you are for me, and I think it's extraordinary. And I admire both of you deeply, your relationship and what you provide for the community, and thank you for doing that work.
Pat Beulah, you were talking at the beginning about the problem of grief and joy of nature and whatever.
Yeah.
And I think we experienced that back in January because we heard about that they're going to be building the wall and destroying in the valley the National Butterfly Center and the Benson Bird Sanctuary. And we'd always said, we need to go, but we just didn't get around to it. Finally, we said, we've got to go now before it's destroyed. So we went. And so I had a lot of grief about it. But when we went, it gave me so much joy because we got to see a green jay that we had never seen before. We got to see Altamira oriole that we had never seen before. They were the most beautiful birds and gave me such joy. So that was my balance between grief and joy.
Yeah, and I applaud
And
you for
need
that.
it both.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Pat, because...
Just talk about that, yeah.
Well, I just really thank you for saying that because I think as environmentalists, don't you feel like we tend to be so driven with our solutions or with our thinking about what's going to make a difference, and we just drive and drive and drive and drive and drive. But what sources us is not that. What sources us is the beauty. It's the gift that we get to live. That's why we care. And whether it's about butterflies or people or, you know, it's all connected. The people and the butterflies, it's all connected, right? So whatever it's about for the individual who's committed, that taking the time to experience the connection to the thing that you're trying to protect, even if you can't protect it, is vital. I really am glad you said that, and I'm glad you did that. Yeah.
Gary Bennett.
Yes.
And I thought it a bit ironic. The major headline in today's Statesman is that fossil fuel groups are organizing to put pressure on the legislature to block the further progress of wind and solar in Texas. You think that people have reached the lowest, and then they find a way to go a little further.
You know, I don't know whether Gandhi actually said this because I haven't studied Gandhi, but I was one of the rare people that I know of that actually watched the entire movie. Most people that I know fell asleep because it's 4 hours long, but I watched the whole thing at the age of like 10, so I'm really proud of that. But anyway, movie Gandhi was sitting at the table with the British, and he said something like, eventually you'll see the wisdom of leaving. And I think the question that was posed to him was like, do you just expect us to leave? And he was like, yeah. Yes, I do. We're not going to fight you, and we're not going anywhere, and you can't control 300 million people. 30,000 people can't control 300 million. So eventually, yeah, you're going to see the wisdom of leaving, because the problems that we have as a society are ours to deal with. And eventually they did. So when is that going to happen? Will it be too late? I don't know. But that's the future I see. And there's a lot of people in Texas making money from wind and solar. And that is an apolitical thing. So I'm also on the board of TxETRA, which is Texas Electric Transportation Resources Alliance, and we're working on the policy and infrastructure for electrification of the electrification of the entire mobility system in Texas. It's an apolitical initiative, and it is not about pushing any one political agenda. It's about advancing an industry whose time has come. And there's a lot of folks who've done that work previously, and many of them in this group, who did that work previously for wind and solar, and it ain't going anywhere. There's too much money in it. Right, and it's cheaper. And that's not why I care. It's not the money, it was why I care. That clearly, that's not what I care about, but still, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, hi. You talked about, what you can do personally and looking at your own life and changes that you can make. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of meat in climate change? I've heard that if we stopped producing and eating cows, that it would get us 70% of the way to climate reduction goals and gases.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I want to say two things about that. One is about the solutions. So if you talk, there's an enormous community of people making a difference in climate here in town. And if you talk to any one of them, they're passionate about their solution, and they're right. So every single person that tells you, I've got the solution to the climate crisis, listen, because they're right. It's not the only solution, but it's a vital solution because we need all of those solutions operating all together, and then even then we might not make it. So yes, reducing meat consumption is important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my mom. She is on a diet for her diabetes that requires high meat consumption. So she doesn't participate in that. Now what she does other things that reduces her emissions to offset that. But absolutely, reducing your meat consumption is one of the best things that you can personally do to impact the climate crisis. And again, it's kind of an idea whose time has come. And if you listen to what's happening in our culture, it is shifting. But I do think that it'll shift faster if it's more about encouraging a plant-based diet rather than making wrong those people who are choosing to eat meat. Because it is part of the diet that we as a culture have established over time. So, we're done with the slides, good, we're good. So I'm never gonna judge someone for the choices they make and what they put in their body. I'm just not gonna do that. And I do think it's a movement whose time has come, if that makes sense.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Janis, you mentioned some events, I think, at Houston-Tillotson on April the 13th. Will there be other events on the following weekend on the 20th and then on April 22nd itself?
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, yeah, you should look at all the calendars. So thank you. You're singing my song. It's like perfect segue. First of all, just to reiterate, April 13th, Houston-Tillotson University is between 11th and 7th, Chicon and Congress on the east side of I-35 near downtown. Practically part of downtown now, and it's one of the most beautiful campuses in our city. And we will be there, and so will Veg Fest, so come join us at 12 o'clock till 6. And then, yes, there's lots of things happening in town on the, oh, by the way, Keep Austin Beautiful is also happening in the morning, and you can volunteer in the morning and then come to our festival. So please do that. They're a very, very important group here in town. On the 20th, yes, there's lots of things happening. But the 22nd, I think, is Earth Day proper. So the 22nd is a day that what we'll be doing is going around and broadcasting the various projects happening around town. So rather than focus on ourselves and our festival, which it's on a Monday too, so the festival doesn't really work on a Monday, but we're going to be going around. So pay attention to the Facebook page, and we'll be broadcasting all of those events all day. And, there's plenty of them, and they're all on, Do 512 and Austin Chronicle. You can find them. There's lots happening, lots of cleanup projects and service projects that day.
All right, thank you very much for a very
Thank you.
helpful presentation.
It's been great being with you guys. Thank you.